Welcome to Climate Weekly, your daily dose of all things climate. We're breaking down the biggest stories of the day, from those wildfire worries here in LA to political shakeups under the new Trump administration. And even a bit of good news today, too. Are you ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's get started.
All right, well, first up, NPR is reporting that January actually saw global temperature records broken. This comes as a bit of a surprise because a lot of predictions were saying that January would be cooler. What do you think this heat wave means for the climate crisis?
Well, it could be a sign that things are heating up even faster than those climate models predicted, which would mean we're probably even less prepared for the impacts of those rising temperatures.
And speaking of things heating up, Daily Climate is reporting on a wave of policy reversals following former President Trump's return,
Yeah.
especially in the energy sector.
Uh-huh.
One of those reversals is Trump's plan to roll back the energy efficiency rules that Biden put in place. He's saying that it's about giving consumers more choice. But stepping back, what are the consequences of getting rid of those standards?
Well, for one thing, those energy efficiency rules helped us use less energy, which means we burn less fossil fuel. If those rules go away, we might see a big jump in how much energy we're using, and that means more greenhouse gases being released, which just makes climate change worse and brings us closer to more of those extreme weather events we're already seeing.
So it's not just about giving people choices. It's about the bigger picture of how we're using energy and how that affects the planet.
Exactly.
And Daily Climate is reporting that it's not just energy efficiency on the chopping block either. Trump is also blocking offshore wind leases, freezing renewable energy grants, and making those clean energy tax credits less certain. What does this mean for states working to reach their climate goals and for investors who are looking to support the clean energy transition?
It's a pretty discouraging signal. States are left trying to save their clean energy plans, and investors are going to be hesitant to support new projects when the future's so up in the air. It feels like we're pumping the brakes on all the clean energy progress we were making.
Definitely feel like a step back from the progress we were seeing. Daily Climate is also reporting that the SEC is halting the climate disclosure rule, which required companies to be open about their greenhouse gas emissions and any risks they face from climate change. So this might sound technical, but what are the implications of putting this rule on hold?
Transparency is really important when you're talking about holding companies responsible for their impact on the environment. That rule was all about giving investors the information they needed to make smart choices about where their money's going. By rolling this back, it'll be harder to track what companies are emitting and what kind of climate risks they're facing.
So it's like we're taking a step back on accountability, too. The LA Times is reporting that on top of everything else, Trump is also targeting something pretty small: paper straws. He's reversing Biden's rule that said federal offices had to buy paper straws instead of plastic. He even said that paper straws don't work.
Right.
What do you make of all this?
It might seem small compared to those big policy shifts, but the paper straw thing kind of shows you where this administration's priorities are. It's like moving away from even taking those baby steps towards sustainability.
It's definitely a change. And the news isn't much better when you look at what's happening here in LA after those recent wildfires.
Yeah.
The Eaton and Palisades fires left a lot of damage, and now residents near those temporary hazardous waste sites are really worried about contamination. The LA Times is reporting that people are especially concerned because sometimes temporary sites become semi-permanent. What are the long-term risks we should be thinking about when it comes to hazardous waste from those wildfires?
Well, you have to remember all that debris from burned buildings and stuff can be full of really dangerous things. And if that waste isn't handled correctly, it can seep into the soil and the water. That puts both human health and an environment at risk. So the concerns of those residents are valid. We need to make sure the cleanup process is really thorough and transparent to avoid any long-term damage.
There's also this debate going on about soil testing after the cleanup is done. The LA Times is saying that the Army Corps of Engineers is insisting that just digging up the top 6 inches of soil is enough to remove any contamination. But a lot of people aren't so sure.
This is exactly why it's so important to have independent experts check things out, do thorough testing, and involve the community in those decisions. If there's no trust and no transparency, then those worries are only going to get bigger. We need to make sure everyone feels safe and confident about how the cleanup is being handled.
And then you add in the financial impact of those wildfires. The New York Times is reporting that California's air plan insurance had to be bailed out for $1 billion because of those fires. So what does that mean for people who own homes in California?
It most likely means homeowners across the state are going to see their insurance costs go up. Insurance companies are losing a lot of money because of these wildfires, and unfortunately, they usually pass those costs on to their customers. It just goes to show you that climate change has a real economic burden, and it raises some difficult questions about who should be responsible for paying for these climate-related disasters.
And California is still dealing with the threat of more extreme weather. NPR is reporting that we've got an atmospheric river headed our way, which could mean debris flows in those areas that just burned.
That's a recipe for disaster. Those burned areas are really vulnerable to flooding and erosion because the soil is so exposed. So when you get a lot of rain, it just runs off carrying all that mud and debris with it. And we've seen before just how destructive those debris flows can be.
And to make matters worse, the LA Times is reporting beach closures and advisories because of fire debris and sewage from those recent storms. It feels like one extreme weather event after another.
It's a harsh reminder that the impacts of climate change are all connected. Wildfires make areas more vulnerable to flooding and erosion, and those heavy rains can lead to landslides and debris flows. It's a vicious cycle that shows us how urgent it is to adapt to our changing climate.
Yeah, and as if we needed another reminder about the wildfire threats. CAL FIRE just released their new fire hazard maps, and the LA Times is saying most areas are actually seeing an increase in the amount of land with those heightened fire safety regulations.
That expansion of those high-risk zones is a serious sign that the danger of wildfires is spreading and getting worse. It's a wake-up call for communities to start adapting, rethinking how we manage our land, updating those building codes, and getting better prepared for emergencies. We have to get serious about dealing with this growing risk.
So before we get too bogged down in all the bad news, let's look at a story that offers a little bit of hope. Daily Climate has a piece about the Sichaju Nation in South Dakota and how they're fighting those diet-related health problems by bringing back traditional Lakota foods.
That's a great example of a community taking control of their health and going back to their roots. Those traditional diets are often full of nutrients and adapted to the local environment, so they can be really effective in dealing with those modern health challenges.
They're working to restore foods like bison and mushrooms, and they even incorporated them into the school lunch program. What's so great about this initiative?
It's that they're looking at the whole picture. It's not just about eating better. It's about food sovereignty. It's about bringing back cultural traditions, and it's about building resilience in the community. They get that food security is essential, and they're taking steps to make sure they can feed themselves sustainably, especially with food costs going up and the uncertainties of climate change.
It's inspiring to see a community being so proactive about taking care of themselves in the face of these global challenges. And speaking of challenges, let's talk about the political tug of war going on in Virginia right now over the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI.
RGGI?
Yeah, Daily Climate is reporting that Virginia Democrats are pushing to get back into RGGI after Governor Youngkin took the state out. So for anyone who doesn't know, RGGI is a regional program that's supposed to lower greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. And Democrats are saying that leaving RGGI is actually costing the state millions of dollars. What are the financial implications of this decision?
Well, with RGGI, states can trade emissions allowances, and that actually generates money for them. That money can then go towards things like clean energy projects, energy efficiency programs, and other things that are good for both the state's economy and the environment. When Virginia left RGGI, they basically gave up that potential income and the chance to invest in a cleaner, more sustainable future.
So it's not just about environmental policy, it's about economic policy too.
Exactly. It's about figuring out those short-term costs and benefits and weighing them against what it means for the state's economy and environment in the long run.
And while Virginia is figuring out RGGI, the rest of the world is facing some tough realities as well. Daily Climate is reporting that a lot of those major emitters, including China and the European Union, actually missed a deadline to submit their updated emissions reduction plans to the UN. What does this delay tell us about the global commitment to addressing climate change?
Honestly, it's a worrying sign that we're not treating up with enough urgency. Sure, there are countries and communities making progress, but this delay really shows that we need stronger international cooperation and a renewed commitment to those Paris Agreement goals. We need a unified global effort to really tackle climate change, and these delays just set us back.
And those delays in cutting emissions have consequences. The UN is saying we're still on track for a dangerous temperature rise of 2.6 to 3.1 degrees Celsius. What would that kind of warming look like for the planet?
We'd be talking about a lot more heat waves, droughts, floods, and rising sea levels, and they would be a lot more intense. It would be devastating for human health, ecosystems, and global economies. We'd see existing inequalities get worse, and it would create new challenges for things like food and water and human migration. Basically, it would be a world struggling to cope with a climate that's out of control.
So the stakes are really high. Daily Climate has an article that digs into an aspect of the climate crisis that we often overlook: consumer culture. They argue that our constant need for all these chemical-laden products is slowing down climate progress. Why is this connection between consumerism and climate change so important?
Well, think about all the plastics, fertilizers, and synthetic materials we use every day. Making all that stuff creates a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions. The more we demand, the more fossil fuels have to be burned to make it. It's a vicious cycle.
So our buying habits are directly contributing to the climate crisis, so what can we do about it?
We need to change how we think about things. Instead of throwing stuff away all the time, we need to start valuing things that last. It's about quality over quantity and choosing products that have a smaller environmental impact. We need to embrace a circular economy where we're reusing and recycling things and relying less on those polluting industries.
It's a big change that needs both individuals and companies to do things differently. And speaking of companies doing things daily, Climate has a report about the Tacker Pass lithium mine in Nevada and how the U.S. government approved it without fully consulting with the tribes who live there.
Uh-huh.
It sparked accusations of human rights violations.
Right.
Several indigenous groups, including the Reno Sparks Indian Colony and the Burns Paiute tribe, say they weren't properly consulted about the mine, even though they have strong cultural ties to the land.
This situation shows us that the shift to clean energy has to be done the right way. We can't just trade one form of environmental injustice for another. It's about making sure that this transition to clean energy respects indigenous rights, protects their cultural heritage, and benefits communities fairly.
So it's not just about switching to clean energy, it's about making that switch in a way that's ethical and fair for everyone involved.
Yeah.
Now let's look at Japan. They just made a big announcement about their energy policy.
I'm interested to hear this. Japan's energy choices have been in the spotlight since Fukushima. So what's new?
Well, according to Daily Climate, Japan is turning back to nuclear power. You might remember that after the Fukushima disaster in 2011, they moved away from nuclear.
Right.
But now they're actually planning to increase their nuclear capacity.
That's a bold move considering how concerned the public is about nuclear safety. It seems like Japan is putting energy security and decarbonization first, even if it means taking on the risks of nuclear power. It's a big gamble that could really change their energy future.
Their new energy plan aims to have nuclear power provide 20% of their total energy output by 2040. They're planning to have 30 reactors up and running by then.
This is definitely going to be controversial. Some people are going to argue that nuclear power is a reliable and carbon-free source of energy that can meet our growing energy needs and help us cut greenhouse gas emissions. But other people are going to point out the risks of accidents, the problems with nuclear waste disposal, and the possibility of proliferation.
It's a major decision with long-term consequences. And speaking of high stakes, Greenpeace is finding themselves in a bit of a tricky situation.
Greenpeace, they're usually the ones making the waves. What's going on?
Daily Climate reports that they're being sued for $300 million by the U.S. energy company Energy Transfer.
Wow, that's a lot of money. What's the lawsuit about?
It goes back to those protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline back in 2016. Energy Transfer is saying that Greenpeace organized those protests and caused them major financial damage. But Greenpeace is fighting back, saying that this is an SLAPP suit.
Oh, a SLAPP suit, that stands for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. It's basically a tactic used to silence people who are speaking out. These lawsuits are meant to scare activists and bury them in legal fees so they can't keep doing their work.
Exactly. Greenpeace says that Energy Transfer is trying to punish them for exercising their right to free speech and protest. They've even filed a case in the Netherlands because of a new European Union rule against SLAP suits.
This case could have a big impact even beyond Greenpeace. It could set a precedent for how corporations deal with activists and how far they can go to stop people from speaking out. It's a crucial fight for environmental activism and freedom of speech.
It's definitely a case to keep an eye on. Now let's bring it back to the U.S., where we have stories from Climate Change Dispatch about how the Biden administration tried to give $50 million to a left-wing activist group called the Climate Justice Alliance, or CJA. But the grant was blocked.
Really? Why was it blocked?
Well, according to the article, the Trump administration saw CJA as a radical group and thought their agenda was too extreme. They also said that using taxpayer money to fund activism wasn't right.
That's interesting. It just shows how different administrations have totally different priorities and views when it comes to climate change and activism. It's hard to make progress when the political landscape is so divided, and even funding for environmental initiatives becomes a battleground.
Absolutely. And while those political battles are going on, some communities are facing some very real economic challenges as they try to move away from fossil fuels.
Yeah.
In Colorado, as coal plants are closing, some towns are actually thinking about storing nuclear waste.
That's a surprising move. Storing nuclear waste is a really controversial issue, and usually communities don't want it because they're worried about safety and the long-term environmental impact. So what's making these towns consider nuclear waste storage?
NPR says it's mostly about survival. Those coal towns have lost jobs and money because those power plants shut down, and they're looking for any opportunity they can get. The federal government is trying to use this to their advantage by promoting nuclear waste storage as a way to bring in money and create jobs.
That's a risky strategy. Those communities are weighing the potential economic benefits against the risks and the social and environmental consequences of having a nuclear waste storage facility. It's a complex decision with implications that will last for generations, and it's bound to spark a lot of debate in those communities.
It's a tough situation, and it shows just how hard it is to ensure a just transition for communities that are so dependent on fossil fuels. And speaking of tough transitions, California's high-speed rail project has hit another snag.
Oh, the high-speed rail project.
Yeah, it's been struggling with delays and going way over budget for years, and Climate Change Dispatch reports that now Trump wants to take back $4.3 billion in federal funds that were supposed to go to the project.
This could really mess things up for the project's future. It's likely to cause even more delays and could even prevent it from being finished. It just shows how these big infrastructure projects, especially ones with environmental implications, are often at the mercy of politics and funding uncertainties.
And Climate Change Dispatch also has a report about a bigger shift in energy policy under Trump. They're planning to stop all the renewable energy projects and ditch that whole net zero push. Instead, they're going to refocus on oil and gas.
That's a big change from what we saw with the last administration, which was all about clean energy and cutting carbon emissions. This move shows that the Trump administration is prioritizing traditional energy sources, probably because they think oil and gas are still economically viable, and they're skeptical about how quickly and effectively we can transition to clean energy.
It's a major shift in policy that will have far-reaching consequences for the energy sector and for the country's climate goals. But it's not like everyone's giving up on clean energy.
Right.
Daily Climate is reporting that those blue states are fighting to keep those clean energy projects going. They're challenging Trump's block on offshore wind leases and his freeze on renewable energy grants.
It just shows how divided the country is when it comes to climate and energy policy. You've got those blue states pushing for clean energy and the Trump administration pulling in the opposite direction. It's a reminder that while more and more people are agreeing that we need to deal with climate change, there's still a lot of disagreement about the best way to do it.
And those disagreements aren't just happening at the national level. Climate Change Dispatch reports that even as Trump is pushing for energy dominance, a lot of states are dealing with local opposition to wind and solar projects.
This is where things get really interesting. You've got these states that are generally supportive of renewable energy, but then you have people at the local level pushing back against wind and solar installations. Things like visual impact noise pollution, property values, and potential harm to local ecosystems all contribute to that community pushback.
So it's not just a political challenge, it's a social challenge too.
Absolutely. We have to be smart about how we plan these projects, engage with the community, and make sure the benefits are shared fairly. If we want to transition to a clean energy future, we need to find ways to address those local concerns and build support for these projects.
And while we're fighting those political and social battles, climate change is already affecting our everyday lives in ways we might not even realize.
Like what?
Well, for instance, your Valentine's Day chocolates might be a little more expensive this year.
Oh, that's definitely something I'd notice. What's going on with the chocolate?
NPR is reporting that there's a cocoa shortage. West Africa, which produces a lot of the world's cocoa beans, had another bad harvest. It's actually the worst deficit in decades.
You have to wonder if climate change is playing a role in this. When you have changes in temperature and rainfall patterns, it can really hurt crop yields, especially for crops like cocoa that are sensitive to those conditions. Maybe this price hike is a sign of things to come as climate change continues to disrupt how we produce food around the world.
It's a good reminder that climate change has far-reaching impacts. And it even affects those little things we take for granted, like our Valentine's Day treats.
It's true. Sometimes those subtle things are the most noticeable signs of how climate change is affecting our lives. And it just highlights how connected everything is, from the climate to the economy to what's on our plates.
And speaking of connections, Daily Climate has a report about a proposal to put a 10% tariff on Canadian oil.
That would be a big deal for both the U.S. and Canada. Canada is one of the biggest suppliers of oil to the U.S., especially for those refineries in the Midwest. Putting a tariff on their oil would probably drive up the price of crude oil, which could mean higher gas prices for consumers.
Experts are saying those U.S. refineries that rely heavily on Canadian crude, like the BP refinery in Whiting, Indiana, would be hit the hardest.
Right.
They might have to pay more for their crude oil or cut back on production, which could have a ripple effect throughout the economy.
It just goes to show you how connected those global energy markets are and how political decisions in one country can affect others. It also brings up the challenge of balancing energy security with economic interests and environmental concerns.
It's a complicated situation with no easy answers. Now, for something a little different, let's talk about sports.
Sports. I wasn't expecting that to come up in their conversation today. What's the link between sports and climate?
The LA Times has an article that's making me reconsider my love for college football.
Hmm.
Apparently, all those flights that teams take for away games are creating a pretty big carbon footprint.
That's an interesting point. We don't always think about the environmental impact of sports, but they definitely have one. All that travel for college athletics, especially when you have those big conferences with teams spread out over huge distances, can add up to a lot of greenhouse gas emissions.
The article even names Stanford, UCLA, and UC Berkeley as some of the biggest carbon emitters among those college football teams.
Wow.
It makes you wonder if there are ways to make college athletics more sustainable.
It's a good question. Maybe we could restructure those conferences so teams don't have to travel as far, or maybe teams could start using more fuel-efficient transportation. Maybe this could even start a conversation about whether all that long-distance travel is really necessary.
It's a challenge that needs some creative thinking and a willingness to change how we do things. Now let's get back to a more serious issue, lead contamination in drinking water.
Ugh, this is a problem that's been affecting communities across the U.S. for way too long.
And now Inside Climate News is reporting that a landmark EPA rule that was meant to lower those lead levels in drinking water might be reversed under the Trump administration.
Really? That's a big deal.
Yeah, that EPA rule was put in place just last year to tighten those limits on lead and copper in our drinking water. It was a big step towards protecting public health. Any attempt to weaken or reverse that rule would be a huge setback and could put millions of people at risk.
Right.
The article mentions that a Republican congressman from Alabama, Gary Palmer, has actually introduced a resolution to block the rule.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying that it's too expensive and puts too much burden on those water utilities.
It's that classic conflict between protecting the environment and economic interests. Of course, we have to think about the costs of regulations, but public health should always be the priority. Weakening those standards for drinking water just to save money is short-sighted and could have terrible consequences for people all over the country.
It just reminds us that decisions about environmental regulations have real effects on people's lives and their well-being. And speaking of having an impact, Daily Climate has a story about the Sichani Nation in South Dakota and their work to fight those diet-related health risks by bringing back traditional Lakota foods.
Now, that's a truly inspiring example of a community taking charge of their health and going back to their roots. Those traditional diets are often full of nutrients and technically adapted to the local environment. They can be such valuable resources for dealing with the health challenges we face today.
They're focusing on restoring those traditional foods like bison and mushrooms, and they've even started incorporating them into the school lunch program. What's so remarkable about this initiative?
It's the fact that they're taking a holistic approach. They're not just improving their diets, they're reclaiming their food sovereignty, they're revitalizing their cultural traditions, and they're strengthening their community's resilience. They understand that food security is essential for their well-being, and they're proactively taking steps to ensure they can nourish themselves sustainably, even with food costs rising and all the uncertainties that come with climate change.
It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the answers to the challenges we face can be found in the wisdom of those who came before us. And speaking of looking to the past to understand the present, let's talk about a surprising discovery that's causing a stir in the scientific community.
I'm intrigued. What's got the scientists buzzing?
Well, NPR reports that January 2025 wasn't actually expected to break global temperature records.
Uh-huh.
But guess what? It did.
That's a big deal. We've been seeing those record-breaking temperatures for the past few years, but the expectation was that things would cool down a bit in January. The fact that they didn't suggests that the pace of warming might be speeding up even faster than we thought.
And the article points out that this unexpected heat wave has climate researchers worried that our models might be underestimating how quickly the planet is warming,
Yeah.
which could have major implications for how we understand climate change and how well we can predict those future impacts.
It's a wake-up call. We're already seeing the consequences of a warming planet, and they're only going to get worse and more unpredictable if we don't take action to cut emissions.
The stakes are getting higher every year. And speaking of raising the stakes, Daily Climate has an article about a potential solution that could make a big difference, a strong carbon tax on shipping.
The shipping industry is one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, but it doesn't get as much attention in those climate policy discussions. Why is a carbon tax on shipping seen as such a game changer?
It's all about giving the industry a financial reason to clean up its act. A carbon tax would make those emissions more expensive, which would encourage shipping companies to invest in cleaner technologies, improve fuel efficiency, and plan their routes more efficiently to reduce their carbon footprint.
It's a market-based approach to environmental regulation. It uses financial incentives to encourage innovation and reduce emissions.
And the article makes another important point. They say that the money raised from this carbon tax should be used to help those countries in the global south that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change.
It's about making sure that the costs and benefits of climate action are distributed fairly. It's recognizing that the people who have contributed the least to the problem are often the ones who suffer the most from the consequences.
It's a question of climate justice. It's acknowledging those historical inequalities that have led to the climate crisis and making sure that the solutions are fair and equitable for everyone.
Right.
It's a complex issue with global implications. And speaking of global issues with local impacts, let's turn our attention back to those devastating wildfires in Los Angeles.
The aftermath of those fires is a stark reminder of the power of nature, but it's also a story of resilience and recovery. What are some of the challenges LA is facing as it tries to rebuild?
Well, the LA Times is reporting that there's a lot of debate about soil testing after the wildfire cleanup is finished. Residents who live near those temporary hazardous waste sites are worried about contamination, which is understandable, especially since they've seen those temporary sites become permanent in the past, leaving behind a legacy of environmental damage.
It's absolutely crucial to be transparent, to involve the community, and to have strict oversight when it comes to cleaning up after those wildfires. Those residents need to know what's going on in their neighborhoods, and they need to have their concerns addressed. Handling hazardous waste is a serious business, and we have to do it with the utmost care to protect both people and the environment.
And the financial impact of those fires is huge. The New York Times reports that California's air plan insurance had to be bailed out for $1 billion to cover the losses from those fires. So what does this bailout mean for homeowners in California?
Well, unfortunately, it probably means higher insurance costs for everyone in the state. Insurance companies are taking big hits because of these increasingly frequent and intense wildfires, and ultimately they pass those costs on to their customers through higher premiums or by offering less coverage. This bailout is just a symptom of the growing economic burden of climate change, and it raises some tough questions about who should be responsible for footing the bill for these climate-related disasters.
And on top of those financial challenges, California is also facing the threat of more extreme weather.
Oh no, it seems like California just can't catch a break. What's the latest threat?
NPR is reporting that a strong atmospheric river is headed towards the state,
Oh boy.
bringing with it the risk of heavy rain flooding and those dangerous debris flows, especially in those areas that were recently burned by those wildfires.
That's a dangerous combination. Those burned areas are incredibly vulnerable to flooding and erosion because the fire has destroyed the vegetation, leaving the soil completely exposed. When you get heavy rain in those areas, the water runs off quickly, carrying mud, rocks, and debris with it, and creating those destructive debris flows that we've seen cause so much damage in the past.
It's a situation that could make the damage from those wildfires even worse and put communities in even more danger. And to add to those concerns, the LA Times is reporting that we're already seeing beach closures and advisories because of fire debris and sewage from those recent storms.
It's a stark reminder that the impacts of climate change are all interconnected. Wildfires make areas more vulnerable to flooding and erosion, and those heavy rains can lead to landslides and debris flows. It's a vicious cycle that shows us how urgent it is to adapt to our changing climate.
And as if we needed another reminder about the wildfire threat, CAL FIRE just released their new fire hazard maps, and the LA Times is saying most areas are actually seeing an increase in the amount of land with those heightened fire safety regulations.
That expansion of those high-risk zones is a serious sign that the danger of wildfires is spreading and getting worse. It's a wake-up call for communities to start adopting, rethinking how we manage our land, updating those building codes, and getting better prepared for emergencies. We have to get serious about dealing with this growing risk.
So before we get too bogged down in all the bad news, let's look at a story that offers a little bit of hope. Daily Climate has a piece about the Sachaju Nation in South Dakota and how they're fighting those diet-related health problems by bringing back traditional Lakota foods.
That's a great example of a community taking control of their health and going back to their roots. Those traditional diets are often full of nutrients and adapted to the local environment, so they can be really effective in dealing with those modern health challenges.
They're working to restore foods like bison and mushrooms, and they've even incorporated them into the school lunch program. What's so great about this initiative?
It's that they're looking at the whole picture. It's not just about eating better. It's about food sovereignty. It's about bringing back cultural traditions, and it's about building resilience in the community. They get that food security is essential, and they're taking steps to make sure they can feed themselves sustainably, especially with food costs going up and the uncertainties of climate change.
It's inspiring to see a community being so proactive about taking care of themselves in the face of these global challenges.
It's inspiring to see a community being so proactive about taking care of themselves in the face of these global challenges. And speaking of challenges, let's talk about the political tug-of-war going on in Virginia right now over the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI.
RGGI. Yeah, Daily Climate is reporting that Virginia Democrats are pushing to get back into RGI after Governor Youngkin pulled the state out of the program. Now, for anyone who might not be familiar, RGGI is a regional cap-and-trade program that's designed to lower greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. Democrats are saying that Youngkin's withdrawal from RGGI is actually costing the state millions of dollars. So what are the financial implications of this decision?
Well, RGGI basically sets up a market for trading emissions allowances, and that generates revenue for the states that participate. Then those states can use that money to invest in things like clean energy projects, energy efficiency programs, and other initiatives that benefit both the state's economy and the environment. So by pulling out of RGGI, Virginia is essentially forfeiting those potential revenue streams and missing out on the opportunity to invest in a cleaner, more sustainable future.
So it's not just about environmental policy, it's about economic policy, too.
Exactly. It's about weighing those short-term costs and benefits against the long-term implications for the state's economy and the environment. And while Virginia is battling over RGGI, the rest of the world is grappling with some tough realities too. Daily Climate reports that most of those major emitters, including China and the European Union, actually missed a key UN deadline for submitting their updated emissions reduction plans. What does this delay signal about the global commitment to tackling climate change?
It's a concerning sign of a lack of global urgency. While there are certainly countries and communities making progress, this delay underscores the need for stronger international cooperation and a renewed commitment to the goals set out in the Paris Agreement. We need a unified global effort to effectively address climate change, and these delays are a setback on that path.
And those delays in cutting emissions are going to have real consequences. The UN is saying that we're still on track for a dangerous temperature rise of 2.6 to 3.1 degrees Celsius. What would that level of warming mean for the planet?
We're talking about a future with more frequent and intense heat waves, droughts, floods, and sea level rise. That kind of warming would have devastating impacts on human health ecosystems and global economies. It would exacerbate existing inequalities and create new challenges for food security, water resources, and human migration. Essentially, it paints a picture of a world struggling to cope with the cascading effects of a destabilized climate.
So the stakes are incredibly high. And the Daily Climate has an article that explores another often overlooked aspect of the climate crisis: consumer culture. They argue that our insatiable demand for chemical-laden products is actually slowing down climate progress. Why is this connection between consumerism and climate change so important?
Think of it this way. All those plastics, fertilizers, and synthetic materials we rely on their production is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. The more we demand, the more fossil fuels are burned to meet that demand. It's a vicious cycle.
So our consumption habits are directly fueling the climate crisis. What's the solution?
It's about changing our mindset from disposability to durability, prioritizing quality over quantity, and choosing products with a lower environmental footprint. We need to embrace a more circular economy where resources are reused and recycled, reducing our reliance on those polluting industries.
It's a systemic change that requires a shift in both individual behavior and corporate practices. And speaking of corporate practices, let's talk about the Thacker Pass lithium mine in Nevada. Daily Climate reports that the U.S. government approved this mine without full tribal consultation, sparking accusations of human rights violations.
This situation highlights a difficult tension. We need lithium for those batteries that power electric vehicles and renewable energy systems. But mining operations can have significant environmental and cultural impacts, especially on indigenous lands. Several indigenous groups, including the Reno Sparks Indian Colony and the Burns Paiute tribe, say they weren't properly consulted about the mine, despite having deep cultural ties to the land.
This case underscores the need for a just transition to a clean energy economy. We can't simply swap one form of environmental injustice for another. We need to ensure that the transition to clean energy respects indigenous rights, protects cultural heritage, and benefits communities equitably.
So it's not just about transitioning to clean energy, it's about transitioning in a way that is ethical and just for everyone involved. Now let's shift our focus to Japan. They've made a significant energy policy announcement.
I'm all ears. Japan's energy choices have been closely watched since the Fukushima disaster. What's the latest?
Well, according to the Daily Climate, Japan is shifting back towards nuclear power. You might remember that the Fukushima disaster back in 2011 had a huge impact on their energy policy, leading them to move away from nuclear, but now they're actually planning to increase their nuclear capacity.
This is a bold move considering the public concerns about nuclear safety. It suggests that Japan is prioritizing energy security and decarbonization, even if it means taking on the risks associated with nuclear power. It's a calculated gamble with potentially significant implications for Japan's energy future.
Their new energy plan aims to have nuclear power provide 20% of their total energy output by 2040. They're planning to have 30 reactors in operation by then.
This decision is sure to spark debate. Proponents argue that nuclear power is a reliable and carbon-free energy source that can help meet growing energy demands while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Critics, however, point to the risks of accidents, the challenges of nuclear waste disposal, and the potential for proliferation.
It's a high-stakes decision with long-term implications. And speaking of high stakes, Greenpeace is finding itself in a rather precarious situation.
Greenpeace, they're usually the ones making waves. What's happening?
The Daily Climate is reporting that they're being sued for a whopping $300 million by the U.S. energy company Energy Transfer.
That's a significant sum. What's the lawsuit about?
It stems from those protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline back in 2016. Energy Transfer is alleging that Greenpeace orchestrated those protests and caused them substantial financial damage. Greenpeace, however, is fighting back, claiming this lawsuit is a classic SLAPP suit.
An SLAPP suit. That stands for a strategic lawsuit against public participation. It's a tactic often used to silence critics and stifle dissent. These lawsuits are designed to intimidate activists and burden them with legal costs, making it difficult for them to continue their advocacy work.
Exactly. Greenpeace argues that Energy Transfer is trying to punish them for exercising their right to free speech and protest. They've even filed a case in the Netherlands citing a new European Union rule against SLAP lawsuits.
This case could have implications far beyond Greenpeace. It could set a precedent for how corporations interact with activists and how far they can go in silencing dissent. It's a critical battle for the future of environmental activism and freedom of speech.
It's a case worth watching. Now let's turn our attention back to the U.S. I've got a story here from Climate Change Dispatch about how the Biden administration tried to give $50 million to a left-wing activist group called the Climate Justice Alliance, or CJA, but the grant was ultimately blocked.
That's interesting. Why was the grant blocked?
According to the article, the Trump administration viewed CJA as a radical group and considered their agenda too extreme. They also argued that using taxpayer money to fund activism was inappropriate.
This situation highlights how different administrations can have drastically different priorities and perspectives when it comes to climate change and the role of activism. It underscores the challenges of navigating a polarized political landscape where even funding for environmental initiatives can become a point of contention.
And while the political battles rage on, some communities are grappling with the very real economic challenges of transitioning away from fossil fuels. In Colorado, as coal plants close down, some towns are actually considering storing nuclear waste.
That's a surprising development. Nuclear waste storage is a highly controversial issue, and it often faces strong opposition from communities due to concerns about safety and long-term environmental impacts. What's driving this interest in nuclear waste storage?
According to NPR, it's largely about economic survival. Those coal towns have lost jobs and revenue with the closure of those power plants, and they're desperately seeking new economic opportunities. The federal government is hoping to leverage this need by promoting nuclear waste storage as a potential source of income and jobs.
It's a risky proposition, though communities are essentially weighing the economic benefits against the potential risks and the social and environmental implications of hosting a nuclear waste storage facility. It's a complex decision with long-term consequences, and it's likely to generate considerable debate within those communities.
It's a difficult choice, and it highlights the challenges of ensuring a just transition for communities that are heavily reliant on fossil fuel industries. And speaking of difficult choices, California's high-speed rail project is facing yet another hurdle.
The high-speed rail project. It's been plagued by delays and cost overruns for years. What's the latest setback?
This time it's coming from Trump administration. Climate Change Dispatch is reporting that Trump wants to reclaim $4.3 billion in unspent federal funds that were allocated to the project.
This move is likely to further complicate the project's future, potentially leading to additional delays and jeopardizing its completion. It's a reminder that large-scale infrastructure projects, especially those with environmental implications, are often subject to political winds and funding uncertainties.
And Climate Change Dispatch is also reporting on a broader shift in energy policy under the Trump administration. They're planning to halt all renewable energy projects and ditch the net zero push, choosing instead to refocus on oil and gas.
This marks a significant departure from the previous administration's emphasis on clean energy and decarbonization. It reflects a prioritization of traditional energy sources, likely driven by a belief in their continued economic viability and a skepticism towards the pace and scale of the clean energy transition.
It's a significant policy shift with far-reaching implications for the energy sector and for the country's climate goals. But not everyone is giving up on the clean energy transition.
That's encouraging. Who's pushing back against this shift in energy policy?
The Daily Climate is reporting that blue states are fighting to keep those clean energy projects alive. They're challenging Trump's block on offshore wind leases and his freeze on renewable energy grants.
This pushback from those blue states highlights the deep partisan divide on climate and energy policy in the U.S. It's a reminder that while there is a growing consensus on the need to address climate change, there are still significant disagreements about the best way to do so.
And those disagreements aren't just playing out at the national level, they're happening at the local level as well. Climate Change Dispatch reports that even as Trump pushes for energy dominance, many states are battling local opposition to wind and solar projects.
This is where things get really interesting. The transition to clean energy is often met with resistance on the ground, even in states that are generally supportive of renewable energy. Concerns about visual impacts, noise pollution, property values, and potential disruptions to local ecosystems can lead to community pushback against those wind and solar installations.
So it's not just a political challenge, it's a social challenge as well.
Absolutely. It highlights the need for careful planning, community engagement, and an equitable distribution of benefits to ensure that the clean energy transition is both environmentally and socially sustainable. We need to find ways to address those local concerns and build community support for these projects if we're going to succeed in transitioning to a clean energy future. Absolutely, it highlights the need for careful planning, community engagement, and an equitable distribution of benefits to ensure that the clean energy transition is both environmentally and socially sustainable. We need to find ways to address those local concerns and build community support for these projects if we're going to succeed in transitioning to a clean energy future.
And while those political and social battles continue, climate change is impacting our everyday lives in ways that we might not even realize. For example, your Valentine's Day chocolates might be a bit pricier this year.
Now that's something I can relate to. Chocolate is serious business. What's behind the price hike?
NPR reports that it's due to a cocoa shortage. West Africa, which produces a large portion of the world's cocoa beans, had another bad harvest, leading to the worst deficit in decades.
I wonder if climate change is playing a role in these crop failures. Changes in temperature and rainfall patterns can significantly affect agricultural yields, particularly for crops like cocoa that are sensitive to those environmental conditions. This price increase could be a glimpse of what's to come as climate change continues to disrupt global food production.
It's a reminder that the impacts of climate change are far-reaching and affect even those things we might take for granted, like our Valentine's Day trees.
Indeed, it's a subtle but tangible way in which climate change is making its presence felt in our daily lives, and it underscores the interconnectedness of our global systems from the climate to the economy to our food supply.
And speaking of interconnected systems, let's talk about a proposal that could have significant ripple effects across North America. The Daily Climate reports that there's a push to impose a 10% tariff on Canadian oil.
This could have major implications for both the U.S. and Canada. Canada is a major supplier of oil to the U.S., especially to those refineries in the Midwest. A tariff would likely increase the cost of crude oil, potentially leading to higher gas prices for consumers.
Experts are warning that those U.S. refineries that rely heavily on Canadian crude, like the BP refinery in Whiting, Indiana, would be hit particularly hard. They might have to pay more for their crude oil or even cut production, which could have broader economic consequences.
This situation underscores the interconnectedness of global energy markets and how political decisions in one country can have ripple effects across borders. It also highlights the challenges of balancing energy security with economic interests and environmental concerns.
It's a complex equation with no easy answers. And speaking of complex equations, let's take a detour into the world of sports.
Sports. Now, this is a topic I didn't expect to come up in our deep dive. What's the climate angle on sports?
The LA Times has an article that's making me rethink my love for college football. It turns out those long flights that teams take to those away games are racking up a hefty carbon footprint.
That's an interesting perspective. We often think of sports as being separate from environmental concerns, but in reality, they too have an environmental impact. The travel associated with collegiate athletics, particularly for teams that compete in large conferences spread across vast distances, can contribute significantly to greenhouse gas emissions.
The article calls out Stanford, UCLA, and UC Berkeley as some of the top carbon emitters among those college football teams. It's making me wonder if there are ways to make college athletics more sustainable.
It's a question worth considering. Perhaps conferences could be restructured to reduce those travel distances, or teams could prioritize more fuel-efficient modes of transportation. It might even spark conversations about the necessity of those frequent long-distance travels in the first place.
It's a challenge that requires creative solutions and a willingness to rethink traditional practices. Now let's turn our attention back to a more serious issue: lead contamination in drinking water.
This is a pervasive problem that has plagued communities across the U.S. for far too long. Lead exposure can have devastating health impacts, particularly for children.
And now, Inside Climate News is reporting that a landmark EPA rule, which was designed to reduce those lead levels in drinking water, is facing a potential reversal under the Trump administration.
This is a significant development. That EPA rule enacted just last year aimed to tighten those limitations on lead and copper in drinking water, a critical step towards protecting public health. Any effort to weaken or overturn this rule would be a major setback and could put millions of Americans at risk.
The article mentions that U.S. Representative Gary Palmer, a Republican from Alabama, has actually introduced a resolution to block the rule, arguing that it's too costly and burdensome for those water utilities.
This is a classic example of the tension between environmental protection and economic interests. While it's essential to consider the costs of regulations, public health should always be the top priority. Weakening those standards for drinking water quality to save money is a short-sighted approach that could have long-term and devastating consequences for communities across the country.
It's a reminder that those decisions about environmental regulations have real-world impacts on people's lives and well-being. And speaking of impacts, Daily Climate has a piece about the Sitaja Nation in South Dakota and their efforts to combat those diet-related health risks by restoring those traditional Lakota foods.
This is a truly inspiring example of a community taking charge of its health and well-being by rediscovering its culinary heritage. Those traditional diets, often rich in nutrients and adapted to local environments, can offer valuable solutions to those modern health challenges.
They're focusing on restoring traditional foods like bison and mushrooms, and they've even integrated those foods into their school lunch program. What makes this initiative so impactful?
It's the holistic approach. They're not just addressing diet-related health issues, they're promoting food sovereignty, reviving cultural traditions, and strengthening their community's resilience. They're creating a more sustainable and self-sufficient food system, which is especially crucial as climate change threatens global food security.
And that's a wrap on Climate Weekly for today. We've covered a lot of ground, from political shakeups and wildfire concerns to inspiring initiatives like the Sitaja Nation's Food Sovereignty Program. We hope this leaves you with a clear understanding of how the climate crisis is playing out both globally and in your own backyard.
And as you go about your day, consider this. What are the ripple effects of these decisions? How will they shape the future of our planet? It's a question worth pondering. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged. AMC.